Hello, this is Rabbi Dr. Juan Bejarano Gutierrez, and today we're going to continue our discussion on interesting differences between Sephardim and Ashkenazim. Today, we're going to be discussing the very important issue of martyrdom and the different attitudes towards this very important topic. Now, perhaps one of the best examples of how outside of religious and social influences, we talked about economic issues, for example, that impacted both Ashkenazi and Sephardi communities was the response to persecution. In Christian Europe, or at least in Central Europe, if we want to denote it in that way, martyrdom or suicide was largely the ideal preferred response. I say ideal because we have an imagery of these Jewish communities in the Rhineland doing this in mass, but in reality it's probably much smaller. That is to say that the ideal is something that was glorified, but it not necessarily something that reflected, the realities of everyday life. And we'll get into that in just a second. Now, whether the attitude towards martyrdom was, as Mark Cohen asserts, an elaboration of the martyr traditions in the Midrash, for example, is unclear because we have Talmudic examples that are provided, but we also have biblical and Talmudic examples that portray something very different, and that's the act of dissimulation, of pretending to be something else, or of not, giving the entire truth. I mean, you can think about Abraham, for example, and Isaac, about the relationships with their wives, not giving all of the information when they're before the Pharaoh or Avimelech, for example. Now, Jacob Katz argues that Ashkenazic views of martyrdom were also influenced by their conviction that Christianity was idolatrous, which of course historically would make sense. Their views were further influenced by the willingness of Christians to suffer martyrdom. And this is very interesting because, again, we often lose the importance of how outside traditions impacted the Jewish communities. In the case of Islam, we have a very different attitude towards this, and this is critical to understand. If Christians were willing to suffer martyrdom, how would it be possible that Jews living in Ashkenaz would not be able to? And of course, the Christians were appealing to biblical examples of Daniel, for example. So this is something that is very critical to understand. Now, Mark Cohen also notes that conversion to escape death likely occurred to a greater degree than is alluded to in the Jewish accounts or the Hebrew accounts of the period, but that martyrdom remained the Ashkenazic ideal. Nevertheless, Rabbi Yehuda Chassid, which we've talked about in the past, refers to both apostates, that is, Jewish converts to Christianity, and various acts of dissimulation, that is, to pretend to be Christian outwardly in this particular context, in his work Sefer Hasidim, making it clear that crypto-Judaism, which we typically refer to in the case of Sephardic Jews, was often present, and that the situation in Ashkenaz was more complicated than is often appreciated. Now, Rabbi Yehuda Chassid, for example, gives us one indication in the following quote. He says, when the members of his community were offered the alternative of either converting or being killed, he, the rabbi, advised them to convert. So you have a rabbinic authority advising his community to do this, and afterwards to return to Judaism. This is not something that most people are aware of. When things settled down, they all returned to Judaism. Nevertheless, since the rabbi counseled his flock to defect from the Jewish faith, his offspring all became apostates, and he is being punished in the hereafter as though he was one who had caused them to sin. So, of course, there's not an approval of this, but of course, we have to sort of read between the lines. It's an indication that it was occurring, and that it often occurred in very significant numbers. Now, it's important to remember that the Jewish communities in the Rhineland were much smaller than those in the Iberian Peninsula. At the height of the Jewish community in Iberia, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of Jews in more than 80 communities. In the Rhineland, the numbers are much smaller. Now, Jews living under Islamic rule had very different responses, according to Menachem ben Sasson. Jews, of course, as we've noted in the past, underwent this extensive cultural Arabization and Islamization, if we want to put it that way as well. As a consequence, Jews did not maintain the same invectives against the dominant religion that Ashkenazic Jews maintained toward Christianity. More importantly, the concept of martyrdom was not similarly significant in Islam as it was in Christianity. And here Mark Cohen notes that in Islam, The martyr is a warrior who dies fighting in a holy war, jihad, as we're familiar with. Cohen states, confronted by religious persecution, Muslims favored outward accommodation or dissimulation. In Arabic, taqiyya, this concept, while inwardly maintaining belief in Islam, rather than having a Gentile model of martyrdom to emulate and even surpass, the Jews of Islam seem to have been influenced by the Islamic response to forced conversion in their own pattern of accommodation. And I think that actually should have been a gentile model of martyrdom. I think the issue here is quite clear that in Christianity, there was a sense that the individual suffers for his faith, and in Islam, dissimulation is more appropriate because the goal, of course, is victory, and the individual can, in essence, return. It's something that was acceptable, and there are various statements that are made in different Islamic sources regarding this. And I think that, without question, it's affected the Jewish community. And in fact, we're going to look at one of these. In addition to all three great Islamic persecutions of the medieval period, that is the persecution under Al-Hakim, the Almohades, which we talked about in reference to the Rambam, Maimonides, and the persecution in Yemen, which the Rambam also addresses in one of his letters, Jews and Christians who were forcibly converted were eventually allowed to revert to their original faiths. The influence of taqiyya, this concept of dissimulation, in my personal opinion, is evidenced in the writings of the Rambam, of Maimonides, and his father in response to forced conversions of Jews in Morocco and Yemen. Abdul Hamid Siddiqui refers to the world of Ibn Abbas, a Sunni commentator, and he writes the following: Al-taqiyya is with the tongue only. He who has been coerced into saying that which angers Allah, and his heart is comfortable, that is to say that his true faith has not been shaken, then saying that which he has been coerced to say will not harm him at all, because al-taqiyya is with the tongue only and not the heart. Very interesting, because you can tell that if you're in a different context, of course, you have Muslims, you have Christians, and you have Jews. The natural allies, as we've talked about before, are going to be Muslims in terms of language, in terms of religious identity, and just the elements, the fact that they are the dominant power, that cultural contact is going to impact the Jewish community significantly. Now, it's clear then that for Islam, the survival of a faithful Muslim is of utmost importance. The ability to feign loyalty to another religion is not considered problematic when faced with persecution. Responding to the situation of Moroccan Jews, the Rambam, Rabbi Moses ben Maimon or Maimonides, states the following: Now, if he did not surrender himself to death, but transgressed under duress and did not die, he did not act properly. So he's saying, ideally, yes, you should lay down your life, and under compulsion he profaned God's name. However, he is not to be punished by any of the 7 means of retribution. Not a single instance is found in the Torah in which a forced individual is sentenced to any of the punishments, whether the transgression was light or grave. And so the Rambam is saying we have a unique circumstance here. People were not doing this voluntarily. We're not talking about a voluntary convert, but you're talking about individuals that are under duress. And of course, this becomes the model for later Jewish communities who face similar circumstances. Now, in the case of the Rambam, it's important to note that he's dealing with Islam, because Islam is less problematic from a Jewish perspective theologically than Christianity. But of course, the model is still there, and I certainly believe that at the end of the 14th century and even into the 15th century, you have Jews that are being persecuted physically, upon threat of death, with violence. And I think that even cases of starvation and economic depravity, if you have children, if you have circumstances that are beyond your control, I think people were under physical and emotional and psychological duress. And I think in the back of their minds, if they had a sense of history, they would have understood that Jews had done this before. And I think it's quite clear that the impact of Islam was still strong, even though Islam was not the dominant power at the end of the 14th century and, of course, into the 15th century. The cultural impact, I think, remained a major element of Sephardic identity, certainly in North Africa and other parts of into the Near East. But I think the same was true for Sephardic communities in the Iberian Peninsula. Now, in this particular case as well, and the Rambam is writing to the community of Yemen, who underwent a similar persecution under Islam, the fact that Islam was generally not considered idolatrous, as I mentioned, was certainly beneficial to the argument, to the lenient view. In addition, in comparison to Christianity, conversion to Islam only required the recitation of the Shahada. So the statement that is made, there's not actually an initiation in the same form as Christianity that involves baptism or praying, of course, to saints, things of this nature, which would represent much more problematic acts theologically. Now, this certainly parallels the Islamic examples provided by Tzidiki, the individual that we talked about in the previous slides. Admittedly, Islamic practice was also much closer to Judaism, which of course I've been stressing since the very beginning of this series, which I think in many ways made it more palatable to Jews when they were confronted with the choice with Islam. But again, I think it's still something that we have to consider when Jews face persecution in later centuries. We read the following from Mark Cohen once again. He says, Jews could accept Islam outwardly, demonstrating their conversion by attending Friday night prayer and avoiding acts disapproved of in Islam, while secretly adhering to Judaism in the privacy of their homes. And I think there's a clear distinction, is that I don't know of cases where Islamic authorities during these times of persecution were as, I don't know if the word would be sophistication, or as committed to determining what people were doing in their homes. So I think that may have also provided Jews a little bit more leeway in terms of their personal practice, and maybe, I wouldn't say incentive, but at least a justification for this temporary dissimulation. Of course, the Rambam states that the individual should ideally leave, and they should, journey out of the country where they can return to Judaism. But I think, from a practical perspective, we have to realize that this was not always as easy as it seems to be. The Rambam did this, but we have sources that sort of indicate that perhaps the Rambam and his family may have dissimulated themselves. So I think that there's a personal element there that I think is important to consider. In any case, the differences between Jews in Ashkenaz and in Sepharad in the Iberian Peninsula versus Central and Eastern Europe have to be weighed against the context of the predominant religious power at that time.